So welcome everyone. Welcome to this jointly hosted seminar. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are around the world. So jointly hosted seminar by the History of Sexuality seminar series and the Modern German History seminar series, both at the IHR, albeit somewhat symbolically at the IHR. If we're online only tonight, I'm joining from Manchester. So my name's Craig Griffiths. I teach and research queer history at Manchester Metropolitan. Co-host tonight is Anna Funke from the University of Exeter. And also, as I mentioned, it's jointly hosted with the Modern German History seminar. And I can see Chris Dillon from King's College London also here tonight. So thank you to the Modern German History team for co-organizing this with us. I'll introduce the speakers in just a moment, but just a quick bit of housekeeping. As you may have heard from that horrible robotic metallic sound, the seminar is being recorded, but we'll stop the recording at the end of the presentation. So the Q&A afterwards will not be recorded. And I should also mention, by way of a content note, that tonight's seminar will include discussion of sexualized violence. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce Anna and then Sam. So I should say that tonight will be an in-conversation format. Anna will say a few words about her book and then be in conversation about her book, the book that you can see pictured here with Sam. So Dr. Anna Hájková is reader of modern European continental history. And here is the book in front of you that you can see here at the University of Warwick. So for the last 4 years, Anna was the co-director of the Warwick Centre for Global Jewish Studies. She's now the director of the European History Research Centre. Anna's first book was published with Oxford University Press in 2021, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt. This is not a work of queer history, but it is a brilliant book. Which I strongly recommend if anyone here is, and as I'm sure many of you are, interested in Holocaust history or perhaps teach Holocaust history. It's a remarkable book, and in that book, Anna develops themes of choice and agency, kind of pushing back against some of the scholarship in Holocaust studies. And these themes have been crucial for the field that Anna has been a foundational scholar in, queer Holocaust history. This work is of long standing. It predates the publication of the book that we're here to talk about tonight. For instance, Anna was awarded the Orpheus Iris Prize of the International Gay and Lesbian Cultural Network for this work back in 2020. She's progressed this work through several edited special issues, including in the German History Journal, as well as the book that we're talking about tonight. People Without History Are Dust, Queer Desire in the Holocaust. This is the revised and updated version of a text that came out originally in German in 2021. Perhaps Anna later on will say a few words about that process of translation, and you can see the German book there. Mention Ohne Geschichte sind Staub with Waustein Publishers. And I'm really, really happy to see this important book available in English to a wider audience, and of course, so that we can use this for Anglophone students as well. Anna will be in conversation tonight with Dr. Samuel Huneke. Sam is Associate Professor of History at George Mason University in Virginia. And Sam is joining us for various reasons. One of them is that he has very, very specific expertise in tonight's topic. Sam's book will be published next year. I Will Not Abandon You, Queer Women in Nazi Germany. That will be published with Toronto University Press, which is where Anna's book has also been published. And I wanted to flag up really the tremendous quality of many, many titles in queer German history with Toronto, work by Laurie Marhofer, Andrea Rothman, Javier Fendrell, and many others. Sam has been working in queer history for a long time and has helped build the field of queer German history in particular. For instance, his 2022 book, States of Liberation, Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, the first comparative study of gay activism in East and West Germany. Also his extended essay in 2023, Queer Theory of the State. And Sam has also taken forward that interest in the state, sometimes a marginalized interest in queer studies, in a book co-edited with Rachel Chin, Reimagining Citizenship in Post-War Europe. That came out earlier this year and is available open access. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Anna and then to Sam. Anna, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. We actually did it that Sam will ask me the first question, and then my answer will do exactly that.
So I'll jump in. Thank you, Craig, for arranging this. Thank you for inviting both of us. It's such an honor and such a pleasure to be in conversation with Anna. As you highlighted, this is such important and foundational work. I also want to flag all of the kind of behind the scenes work that Anna has done over the years to support queer Holocaust history and queer German history, encouraging scholars, including myself, to publish in the field, maintaining a really excellent bibliography of all the scholarship in the field. So it's not just her publications that are so important, but all of the sort of extracurricular support that she provides to the field. And so with that, I thought, Anna, I would ask if you could start by simply introducing the book quickly for those in the audience who aren't already familiar with your work. And I'm really particularly interested in hearing you talk about a tension that I think already appeared in Craig's introduction, namely, how are you defining queer Holocaust history, and how is that different, or where is that different from the history of LGBTQ people under the Nazis?
Mm. Thank you so much, Sam. And really, I'm indebted to Craig and to Jana for inviting me, for organizing it. I cannot help but think back 5 years ago. I gave another talk for IHR History of Sexuality. It was also online. There were 400 people in the audience. Not everybody came because they really cared about the topic so much. I was in the middle of a very unpleasant lawsuit and coverage, all of which was pretty unfair. It was horrible. And the reason why I am here to tell the story and continue doing my work was thanks to the solidarity of people I knew, people who helped me, people I did not know who helped me, people to whom I was maybe thoughtless and nasty. And that has really taught me a lot. So thank you, Jana. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Sam. Thank you all. Queer Holocaust history is quite a departure because it's a field that looks at Jews who were persecuted because of their race, who were deported to concentration camps and ghettos and went into hiding, some of whom survived, many of whom did not survive. So it's a history that starts basically after 1941 with the deportations, and who engage in same-sex conduct, love, desire. Sometimes they were sexually assaulted, or they were gender non-conforming. That is my definition of queer Holocaust history. The big difference to the many, many excellent studies before me, some of which have happened and some of which are very excitingly coming out, just like Sam's book, Alois Champion's research on gay men in Nazi Germany, which is a PhD at Royal Holloway. I do not look at these stories through the perspective of why were these people persecuted. So queerness is not the reason why they end up in the concentration camps. People such as Jeffrey Giles and Rüdiger Lautmann and Claudia Schupman and many, many others have written those histories. They have also written those histories when, not that today it is necessarily always easy to write about queer history in the German history context. German history, both in Germany and abroad, is excellent, but sometimes a little bit conservative. Yeah. People look at us as if we are like exotic people. And in German, it's even more difficult. We can talk about it in Q&A, but maybe we have something more interesting to speak about. And I take it a bit further since my background is in Jewish Holocaust history. We have here Chris Waters, who for many years was the colleague of the wonderful Alexandra Garbarini, who is my great role model and mentor, and I'm lucky to say friend. We look, Jewish Holocaust historians, at victims, subjectivities, experiences, how they navigated their agency. We do not care about the perpetrators so much, or we look at the perpetrators when they're somehow important for the victims. That is quite an important departure from the perpetrator-centered Holocaust history that was there. I mean, in Germany, it has never gone away. And around the world, perpetrators still remain quite a keen topic. I think for all kinds of reasons, some of which are of contemporaneous importance. I don't have to remind as of the elephant in the room, which is the current administration in the US and the quite risen populism around the world. I'm a dual citizen. One of my citizenships is Czech. Today, we got a new prime minister, which is a populist Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. So all of those topics are quite urgent, and therefore I think there is an ethical dimension to asking what were the victims thinking, not why were the perpetrators perpetrating them, but what were the Jews, the shop sellers, the sex workers, the ordinary people, the cute children and the ugly adults. What were they experiencing? How they were navigating it? Not reading the history through the prism that eventually everybody is murdered, but looking at the last years and weeks and days of the experience. So that is one part of the story that I'm doing. The other part is, and that's something that we will talk about a little bit less, but it's still quite important for me, is I designed the book as crossover trade. I specifically did not want to write a book that will be read by 5 colleagues, of whom 6 will take the time of sending me an email telling me why they disagree. I wanted the book to be read by colleagues, to be possibly, if things go well, assigned to undergraduate and graduate syllabi, but I also wanted basically to have a young self or somebody who is like my mentees to take the book and give it to the homophobically challenged relatives and say, here, read the book. Queer people are not a woke discovery of the last 20 years. They've, have been queer desire. There have been gender non-conforming books. This is not a whitewash history of, poster heroes. This is history with everything on it. And it's also super interesting history. And there are real people with real jobs who teach at Russell Group universities who write these books. So that was another point to why I wanted to write the book. I also wanted to write a book as a bit of a manual for people who are interested either in queer history or history of sexuality, whether they come from Holocaust studies, from Nazi Germany or whatnot, to kind of see how it is done. So quite a lot of my footnotes and some of the stories also trace how I did the research. And I'm a very archivally bound historian. It's something that Sam and I always bond about, that we go to the archives and we get the archive fever. And it's super interesting. Maybe Craig, you could unmake me a host again so that I don't get the, how do you call it, notifications. That was that. And last but not least, I wanted to tell stories. Having lived in Great Britain the last 13 years, I have really kind of moved towards the British tradition of history of telling stories that are really, really interesting and weaving in a little bit like Parmesan, the bits of theory and analysis. But I want to write a history that we will just sit down and say, okay, it is the Holocaust. It's not going to be a happy story, but it's an interesting story. And there I smuggle the difficult bits so that people get thinking. I don't have neat ends. I have very difficult ends, and that's what I appreciate.
Thank you. Yeah, rereading the book because I had read the German version and then rereading the English version, both times it does strike me pleasurable isn't the right word, but it is a book you can just sit down and read, and you have these really moving stories in them. And I think you've succeeded in making sure that the theory is there, that you're making these arguments, but it's not immediately upfront. It's not sort of whacking you in the face. And for the person who, is maybe not a professional historian or a graduate student, they can enjoy the stories and maybe they'll get some of that theory sort of by osmosis, but it's not a barrier to entry. In terms of the theory, though, one of the really key ideas here, and I think we've already almost touched on it, is intersectionality. Now, this is a term that has gained a lot of currency in the humanities and the social sciences over the last sort of 20 years or so. And that's sort of in spite of the fact that it comes out of actually this very niche sort of legal field, critical legal studies. And it's specifically associated with the work of the legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw here in the US. And she, of course, used it, or maybe not of course, but as some people know, she used it specifically to diagnose the legal status of Black women in the US. And yet, despite that, it's sort of blossomed into being a widely applicable term. At the same time, because it has sort of blossomed and found use in so many different areas, it is also widely maligned and I think also widely misunderstood. So I'm really curious to hear you talk about what the term is doing for you, how it allows you a kind of new purchase on queer history in the Holocaust.
Mhm. Thank you. Holocaust history has sometimes a bit of a bent of being descriptive. And I think any good history needs a little bit of analytical point, or maybe quite a bit. And theoretical underpinning is necessary for any good history that we want to write. The key point for departure for me, and a bit of a response that I got for years when I was starting this work from 2015 to 2018, was an almost blindness to the point that I was trying to make, because there was a widespread assumption that all Jewish victims during the Holocaust were heterosexual and all of the LGBT victims were Gentile. And these two worlds may have met in the line for food in the camp, but that was about the extent of it. Maybe there was a homosexual couple who tried to sexually assault a Jewish people, to which we will come in a bit, but that there could be Jewish victims who either self-identify as gay, and we will also get to the question of identities and whatnot, because that's something that I think queer history still needs to, for German history, take on board even more strongly. But that these two worlds overlapped, and that the overlap is incredibly important for our understanding of both, that did not happen. And really, intersectionality explains it best. Also, intersectionality, like all good analytical concepts, does not slavishly just need to be applied to the experiences of Black women. Just like decolonization can very powerfully explain situations outside of former colonies or still current colonies, it is a field about, to stay with intersection, if I would to give you my ad hoc working explanation or definition, about how defining belonging to different categories or two different axes influences your position. Not necessarily only makes it worse, but being Jewish and being queer, one means that you get deported to the camps. Second one means saying flippantly, you cannot tell your story if you want to talk about your queerness, because the overwhelming homophobia in the camps, and with that we are kind of coming to one of the stories I'm telling, or one of the really crushing facts that already scholars such as Inza Eschebach or Uta Rautenberg have worked about. And Uta Rautenberg's book is also coming out with Toronto in the coming spring. What we have among the Jewish and the political and other prisoners, but not only in the concentration camps, also in the Soviet gulags, is quite overwhelming homophobia. These camps are often monosexual. People will have sex because being sexually active is one of the things that people often do. It also gives them a sense of comfort. It's a power statement. What all sexuality means is one of the things that I do in the book. And the others judge them. They judge them quite harshly, much more harshly than witnessing sexual violence that is heterosexual. And of course, bearing testimony is socially dictated. If we are told by our surrounding that we are disgusting because we are queer, it's really hard to say, this is my biography, how I survived these three camps. Also, I'm a lesbian and it's fine. It's really, really hard. Some people manage, but very, very few. We have something similar also about the so-called asocials and the so-called habitual criminals, where they write a memoir, but they do not mention that they were habitual criminals. There is one such testimony from Flossenberg, which is really striking that way. So the fact that people could not bear testimony is really important, because as Holocaust historians who write about Jewish Holocaust history, we really only work with self-testimonies. If there are no self-testimonies, we cannot write this history. And with that, I guess I want to come to the last point, and that is decolonizing Holocaust studies. So already before Black Lives Matter, I guess I've given it ample thought, but really Black Lives Matter was for me an invitation to think critically about blind spots and power hierarchies and erasures in Holocaust history. And the fact that Holocaust history can be, even though it's a story or history of a genocide and of erased people who suffered enormously, not only of Jews, but of course of Sinti and Roma and others, It is also a history that is constructed with a useful narrative that actively remarks on some groups as somebody who almost deserved to be there. Ari Yoskovich, in his Reign of Ash, speaks about that point very movingly about how little we know about Porachmos, about Sinti and Roma during the Holocaust, because in a way our perception of the project of Nazi genocides has been written from Jewish perspective. So in smaller measure, this applies for Jews too. And I think that's maybe enough now.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I think, again, it's a term that you're applying to the specific sort of case studies you're dealing with, but it's so generative because other historians in the field can take it and sort of apply it to whatever they're talking about. I think for my own work, it was really helpful to help make sense of the category of asocial, right? Which is this, sort of nebulous grab bag that clearly is relying on a kind of intersectionality idea. Another, sort of theoretical bent to the book that I found really evocative, and unlike intersectionality, I think is something sort of original, you applying intersectionality to the Holocaust is original, but obviously the term comes from older work. But this is an idea that I think is original to your work. And so on page 50, you write, quote, "To tell one's own story, to testify, is an elementary part of what I term historical citizenship." Now, as Craig mentioned, I just edited or co-edited a book on the history of citizenship in 20th century Europe. And so, again, it's a really interesting term. And I'm really curious to hear you say more about how you're defining the term, what that term does analytically, and how it helps you grapple with queer Holocaust history. And then I also was really curious to hear if you had sort of thoughts about how historians might kind of take this concept and apply it in other historical contexts.
So, Sam, halb so schnell, as they say in German, not quite so quickly.
I'm
I
so
will
sorry.
answer the first question and then, I fell from the bike year and a half ago. I'm a bit forgetful. Maybe I will not forget, but maybe I will forget. Then you will ask me.
Yes.
I love that you ask about historical citizenship. It's my secret favorite. So a bit of a intellectual trajectory. In writing my first book that I'm very pleased that Craig thinks about kindly, I was really struck how the inmates of Terezin started thinking of themselves as citizens and of the ghetto as a polis. Even though they were incarcerated, even though everything was horrible, they felt responsible and they felt themselves as a part of something stable. And they started thinking about those 3.5 years as something that was basically never ending. And when I was then asked, I think in 2015, to contribute an essay about women in Theresienstadt and how to think through that, I thought, of course, on paper, women and men were in the Jewish self-administration equal, but women had all kinds of drawbacks. So let's apply here citizenship. I was then quite a lot in conversation with Maura Hametz, who was finishing up a book about citizenship in Italy through 19th and 20th century. So thanks to her very hands-on help, I came to be aware of the various debates on citizenship and the hard citizenship and the soft citizenship. So, of course, here I apply the concept of the soft citizenship. Of course, nobody has, people do have ID in Theresienstadt, but it does not give them any citizenship after the war. But soft citizenship, who gets to belong, who doesn't get to belong, is quite a crucial question in any social studies, including history. So just as I was finishing the essay, I thought, well, I have this baby paper back then in 2016, which is really an embryo. And I remember thinking about it and realizing that for a victim who did not survive, for us to be aware of him or her or them, they need to have a memorial, or they need to have a name, or they need to have a grave. Now, of course, Holocaust victims don't have a grave. That's why we have Jeskorbycha. Or in Western Europe, we have the Gedenkbücher and the memorial books. That's why, the citizens of Bielefeld or Rokitane will go to the former sites, to the sites of the memorials and have their, a sign. The citizens of Rokitane are giving this sign for all the Jews who were sent to Theresienstadt or to Sobibor and never came back. Yeah, and never again or whatnot. it can look utterly symbolical, but there is something, and I don't think people just do that because they want to whitewash their hands. I think people really, really care. And queer victims are not part of the story because their queerness marked them as different. The fellow survivors were ashamed of them. And one of the things that the homophobic narratives have in common is that they never say, or very rarely do they say, Thomas Schmid, who was a homosexual and he came from this place and he liked his steaks raw and only drank his coffee black. Also, he was obnoxious because he was a homosexual. They will say there was this really, really difficult guy who was gay. And with that, these people almost disappear or completely disappear from history. And of course, when we talk about a genocide being completely erased from history because we are seen as non-virtuous, is an act of extreme violence. And it brings me, as we were discussing just before, to the bigger questions about who gets to belong to history, who doesn't get to belong to history. In fact, I have a somewhat entertaining anecdote pertaining to the title. I did not come up with the title myself. I used to be active in the Czech Society for Queer Memory, and at some point, I think in 2018, the back then committee was interviewed by a Czech leftist journalist. I was coming down with a stomach bug, and I was increasingly not feeling well. And I was kind of grasping after air and trying to make the very point I'm making, and I'm saying people without history, almost nothing there, as if they have disappeared. They're this tiny, tiny thing. And the journalist, God bless him, said, people without history are dust. And I said, yes, that. And because he's a very smart journalist, he then used it as a title. And I thought, this is a good title. I will always use it. So that is the first part of question. And you have the second part of question.
Yes. So I think you've answered most of the question, but I was curious to hear, I think when we as scholars come up with these ideas, we sort of have at least a hope for how other scholars will go and use it or cases where they might apply it. And so I was just curious if you have any sort of hopes or thoughts about where this concept of historical citizenship might crop up next in historical studies.
I mean, obviously, I hope that people will consider critically who gets to belong and who are the main actors and who are the sub actors. I mean, to have a democratic version of history where, say, in the big overview books about Nazi Germany, you don't have like one page about queer people and two lines about trans people. That is problematic. I think historical citizenship for people who want to think critically about the history they are doing in the introductions or how they frame the whole thing is a useful approach. But also some, that there is a great number of very useful works about voices in history, who gets to write the story, what do we know and what not. Not necessarily from queer perspective, but from other perspectives. If people find my work useful, I'm very glad. But, the readers will be the judges of that.
No, I mean that's certainly the true with all of our work. I'll say though, I think one thing that has really struck me listening to you talk about this is that your emphasis on telling stories isn't just to make a readable book for your readers, but it actually is performing that historical citizenship or restoring that historical citizenship to these individuals who have been robbed of it. And I think to your point, I think many of us share that frustration with the kind of big synthetic histories of Germany or of the Holocaust, where you get a footnote or a paragraph about queer victims, but they aren't embracing that kind of intersectional approach of saying, actually, this is tied in with all of the other modes of persecution and experience. So it's really helpful to hear you lay all
Mhm.
this out. Okay.
And thank you for
Um,
that point. I'm writing
oh,
it down. It's a great point.
well, I just am taking what you're giving me and synthesizing it. So another really important sort of duality in this book and in queer theory has to do with identity. And, as we know, identity has been sort of one of the chief preoccupations of the history of sexuality and of queer history, basically since it was created as an academic field. That said, in my view, the field has sort of taken a pretty marked turn away from identity, and there's all sorts of questions that historians are asking that have less to do with identity formation and more to do with other questions. And in many cases, historians have started to theorize kinship as a better sort of analytical term instead of identity. Kinship is obviously a core feature of People Without History Are Dust. There's one, sort of particularly moving passage you're writing about Margot Heumann. And, for my money, I think the passages where you're writing about Heumann's experiences are really the most moving in the whole book. And you write, quote, her biography leads to an investigation of queer kinship or the possibilities of so-called non-biological family configurations which emerged during the Holocaust. And so I'm really curious to hear if you can say a little bit more about the role that kinship plays as a concept in the book, both what it's doing in the book and also your kind of trajectory to using it as a scholar. Um, and sort of, well, and then I have a follow-up question, but I'll hold that for now.
Yeah, I do want to spend a few words speaking about hard sexual identity because I think it's quite important, and this may sound basic to you some, but we do not know about the majority of people we write about, how they self-identified. In fact, we can assume about many of them that they simply did not have the epistemological tools, they did not have the knowledge to say, I am gay. Yeah, you have Christopher Isherwood in Berlin. Body Ashton tells the story much better than me, on whom, like, a pretty Berlin woman says, do you want to have coffee with me? And he says, Madame, ich bin schwul. And she's like, alles klar. But we know for the UK, and Laura Dawn wrote about it very well in Disturbing Practices, and also about a number of other countries, that people often just do not have the knowledge. Now, it is different for Central Europe. And we know from Joe Nestle and Molly Applebaum and others that people actually know that there is something like same-sex desire, and that not only is there acts and practices, but there is sexual identity on the table. But does really everybody know that? I discussed that with Molly Applebaum, a 12 or 13-year-old in Krakow, outside of Krakow, in Dąbrowa Tarnowska, who has a crush on an older friend, and she says in her diary, I love you with the lesbian love. Now, you do not know they are lesbians, so you will not actually understand that what I feel for you is love. And I thought this is such a wonderful passage to discuss exactly that. And this, of course, a big difference to Alan Turing, who did not know that he's gay because he was not gay. He was engaged in sexual acts and practices. This is not an academic exercise. I think to actually arrive at that point is quite important. I guess some for you it will be the same, that every so often when I start talking about queerness, whether it's in Germany or in North America, there will be some disgruntled, usually somewhat older people who will say, I am not queer, I'm homosexual. And I'm like, well, I'm not forcing you to be queer. My point is that queer is an inclusive category that collects both people who self-identify as LGBTIQ and people who engage in acts and practices. And the last point that I want to say on that, and I think is quite crucial, is a bit of a crux of queer history is the pesky question like, are you not outing people? Now, if I find a story in an archive that the archive does not dictate me to anonymize, and the people have passed away, this is fair game. Other people will see differently. This is how I roll. When Margot Heumann, who was, by the way, if people are listening and don't know, Margot Heumann was a German Jewish survivor who, after the war, emigrated to the States. When she was in Theresienstadt as a teenager, she fell in love with a Viennese girl called Ditta, and the two of them had a romantic and sexual relationship. After the war, Margot continued having sex and falling in love with women, whereas Ditta married a man and never had any relationships with women again. And then Margot, when she was, I think, 88, allowed me to interview her, and that interview is the only existing self-testimony of a Jewish female Holocaust survivor who speaks about her queerness. So that is the basis of the chapter. And Margot was also really, really great. So when Margot passed away in May 2022, she was eulogized in a number of big newspapers, in the Times of London, in the New York Times, and the Washington Post also wanted to write an obituary. And the journalist who interviewed me, whose work I respect very deeply, and she wrote a beautiful, very well-researched obituary for Joan Ringelheim. She kept asking over and over, but Washington Post has the rule of not outing people. If I will write about Margot's girlfriend from the camps, Dita Neumann, will I not out her? And I tried to tell her that thanks to the divide from outing people because it's a hard sexual identity to someone who engaged in queer acts and practices is not outing. In the end, the obituary did not come out, but I think this is a useful, not conflict, but a useful conversation to do about. I also was recently at a conference in Vienna where Andreas Brunner and I were basically holding the fort of making the point that queer history is not dishonorable. And this kind of fear of outing also is bordering on shame. And that when we say that queer history is shameful, then well, we have a bit of a problem. Kinship. I am coming here from Holocaust history. And of course, my background is as a Holocaust historian. And what kind of gave me the push was the great Holocaust historian Sybil Milton, a really important feminist scholar, one of the first to write about photography and also the Nazi persecution of Sinti and Roma, who passed away, I think, in 2000, 2001. And one of her really influential works was about women prisoners in concentration camps. And she was the first one to theorize that women survived in groups. However, she called the groups non-biological families. And maybe this is quite a pesky detail. I'm being a pesky historian, raising a giant mountain out of a footnote or out of an anthill. But reading through perspective of queer theory, differentiating between biological families and non-biological families, kind of makes the impression as if one family was the real deal and the non-biological family was a bit of a weak reflection that is fake, that is artificial, that only the horrors of the Holocaust bring about. And rereading Kath Weston and Judith Butler and others reminded me that basically operating with kinship and not differentiating between biological and non-biological families and recognizing that camps, as horrible as they were, also very profoundly reshuffled people's bonds of belongings, and people make the call, with who will I share food? Who will I fight for? With who will I go on transport? Those were thoughts that I already had for Theresienstadt, and I was kind of burning to try to implement it as a theoretical underpinning for this book. So in the second chapter of the book, I basically show it for all of the 5 stories that I'm performing and telling there. Yes, that's what I do.
Yeah, no, it's again, I think kinship is such an important and evocative and useful analytical tool for us. I think especially, I mean, I'm, much more, as Craig mentioned, interested in persecution and the state and sort of the political utility or the political economy of these things. And I think kinship actually helps us get away from kind of the identity politics that oftentimes gets attached to particular identity groups. Um, so I think one of the other things kinship allows you to do in this book is talk about agency. And I know agency is really important to you both in this book, but also in a lot of your earlier work. And I think it's particularly related, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong in this reading, but I think for you it's particularly related to histories of sexual violence. And histories of sexual violence, most of the history of sexuality, I think, is actually in one way or another the history of sexual violence, but that's definitely true in these sorts of conditions of imprisonment, persecution, genocide. And so I'm interested in hearing about how you handle that sort of balance between agency and sexual violence. And here's also a moment, and I can come back to this question if you want, about your method as an archival historian, because, this isn't just a question of how do I write about it, how do I theorize it, But what are you doing in the archives? How are you making decisions about which stories to pursue and write about and include?
Mhm. Yeah, I will start with the second one because I don't want to say it's simple, but it's more straightforward to answer. There are so few of these stories that I basically have a Word document where I note all the names and the chief sources of stories that I come across. Most often, I cannot actually cross-check these stories. If you have an annoying guy, if you have the monster who sexually assaulted someone, you cannot cross-check them. So if I can cross-check people, I will look at transport lists. If I can find out the name and birth date, I can see if did they survive? Where did they go after the war? Did they have children? Did they apply for reparations if they lived in Czechoslovakia or in Germany or in Austria? Or, had a link to them. So lots of people apply for the so-called Wiedergutmachung. Uh, I will contact the relatives to see if there are any papers, and I write, a short email saying, "Hello, this is my name. That's what I do. Do you have any papers?" Lots of people get back in touch, and sometimes they know nothing, and I just grateful that they can talk to with me. Some people never write back. Some people write back, "Queer Holocaust history, you are the devil," and I'm like, fine, don't talk to me. That's how consent forms for all histories work. And I amass material. So basically, the book in front of you is something on which I work for 6 or 7 years. But often I also quite enjoy collecting these materials and also showing what I know and what I do not know. And also some stories that I may read quite critically. So it is a lot of archival one after another. And also since of course, I'm no longer single and I have a job. I cannot go for 2.5 years to the archives as I did for the dissertation. So it's much easier that I now have this job where basically this kind of work means going for 3 days to Duisburg and for 5 days to Krnov and whatnot. The question about sexual violence and of agency is, I think, one of the most pressing questions for queer history right now and queer German history in general. Jen Evans mentions in her Queer Art of History the hierarchical age difference relationships that are so defining for 20th century queer German history, and that is particularly pronounced for Holocaust history. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat the stories I'm researching. One of the things that survivors will or would have told you about queerness in the camps, what they would say that sexual violence, it's the prisoner functionaries who, and now I should give trigger warning because this will be quite in your face, who kept teenager prisoners, often Soviet or Jewish, and groomed them as sexual slaves. These boys are either raped or sexually or live in a relationship of sexualized violence. Some of them have a limited choice, as in they decide to stay in these relationships. Some of them are sexually assaulted and cannot get out of it. Some of them are sexually assaulted, then they figure out what is happening and they manage to get into a different barrack. Of course, many, many people do not tell the stories. William Jones wrote a wonderful, moving, and quite remarkable dissertation with Zoe Waxman, and I think that book will come out with Oxford in 1 or 2 years. So if people are interested in that, I would really urge them to check out Will Jones's work or also Dorota Glowacka's, because while we have lots of research about sexual violence against women, sexual violence against men has been long quite a tabula rasa. This is, of course, a history that has prehistory, and I know that Jana and Craig have very courageously in their work invited people not to shy away from these difficult queer histories of important queer models who are racist, or people who really judge others for not being out enough and not being activists with big rainbow flags. When we, however, look at some of the famous gay victims, is, paragraph 175 is the pink triangle, people such as Karl Gorath, one of the best known gay Auschwitz survivors. Gorath did not end up in prison only because he slept with men. He also slept with boys, or he had sexual acts with men, with boys. And this is something that people who have been writing about him and researching him knew for decades, and they chose not to write about it. Then, of course, came our old comrade Alexander Zinn and made it into a hatchet piece. And I think what is the big challenge in writing these histories is not to sugarcoat it, not to hide it away, and not to judge. Because, like, if you need me to tell you that sexual abuse of children and teenagers is wrong, then we have a problem. At the same time, to stay with Gorat, he's someone who saved Soviet POWs in Neuengamme and who is a fairly decent capo in Auschwitz. And he's very courageous in speaking for decades with the gay activists in Bremen. This is the whole story. And something I tried to do for the example of Friedrich Hirsch, who is quite a well-known story of a German Jewish Zionist who, when he was 18 or 19, escaped from Germany to Czechoslovakia, settled in Brno, was a youth leader in a Zionist sports organization. And already there, we have the first testimonies that he was sexually attracted to some of his wards. And sometimes they said, no, it was fine, but sometimes something more happened. Then just before the deportation to Theresienstadt, he put his hand into the shorts of an 11-year-old boy and touched up his genitals. After which the older brother of the groped boy beat Freddy Hirsch up. And then are continuous such stories from Hirsch in Theresienstadt. For a long time, I have to say, I thought these are stories that basically are seeking to ostracize and stigmatize the gay foreigner Hirsch. And it is, I cannot say that this is my merit. I was writing about Friedrich Hirsch and his boyfriend for an American Jewish magazine, and the editor told me, Anna, we are after Me Too. If we believe all women, we also have to believe boy victims. You have a first-person testimony of a named person saying that Hirsch assaulted him. You need to rewrite the passage and believe the boy. And I realized he is right. I was just so skewed in my view that basically all accusations of gay men as assaulting children are homophobic that I could not even fathom that something of that could have happened. So that is, I guess, something that is a bitter pill that I serve in the book, but I think is an important one. I do not do it to demonize Hirsch. I still see Hirsch as a great guy who did amazing things for children and was very, very courageous, also quite vain. But it's a very mixed bag. Now, lots of people are mixed bag, and I think that is an important insight to have. And on agency, the last point, I want to come back to the discussion of people that I had before, is the difficult moment that happens when these teenagers who are being coerced and groomed into these relationships, when they realize what's happening, and then they start deciding how are they going to operate it. Can they get away? Can they also decide this is too horrible and I will let myself be rather shot? Because some people who experience sexual violence walk into the electric barbed wire. And here I would say this is a choice. It's an enforced choice, but it's a choice that we still need to take seriously because it's the only choice that the Holocaust victims had. And this is why we should take it seriously. That's my disagreement with the concept of choiceless choices. And I write about Nate Leipziger, a Jewish boy from Chorzów, not so far from Sosnowiec, who is imprisoned with his father in a satellite camp of Groß-Rosen in Fünfeichen, and a Polish Gentile capo called Janek or Johnny starts sexually assaulting him. And for all kinds of reasons, Nate decides to stay there. There's also food, there's good clothing, there are cigarettes. He's ashamed to tell his father. So it's a confidence that he shares with his, groomer. Confidence is quite important for understanding of kinship, and not all kinship is good and romantic, right? That's one of the things that I'm writing about. And what is so striking about Leipziger's testimony that came out with Azrieli Foundation, eventually Janek looks for a new enforced lover. And Leipziger writes, I was actually envious and jealous of the new boy. I missed the affection of the couple. And I think this is quite a clear statement about the coercive and still choices that he made. And in the horrible and terrifying and brutal world of the camps, even the little affections and the very painful sexual assaults that he experiences, what meaning they carry and how they change the society in which people live. I will go here back to what Craig was saying earlier. I am really obsessed with the life in extremis, and I feel very strongly that we should not say that the society in the camps is a society completely apart. It's just one version of the society we live. When we look at the studies of histories of sexual violence and domestic violence and the choices people make, many of them are very difficult and unpretty. And these coercive relationships between teenagers and rapists from the camps are one option of that. I'm not describing this as consent because I do not think consent is a relevant category for the camps. You cannot say to someone, no, thank you, and then not suffer the consequences. And this is why we should not talk about consent, apart from very few exceptions. That's my bit of a disagreement with Dr. Jones. However, agency is there, but it may be difficult for us to stomach what forms it has.
Okay, I think that is probably a good point to pause and turn it over to the audience for a Q&A, which I believe Craig will moderate.